So, in this week's chapters, we see the Duke and the King attempting to pull off their most elaborate and their most despicable scam yet. And why is it so despicable? We can see that Huck is disgusted by it in the last chapter that we read, and all throughout these current chapters as well. He's just kind of nauseated by how the Duke and the King are getting away with this. Well, so far, we've seen them either conning money out of people who weren't the best individuals anyway. Think of the crowd at the Royal Nonsuch. The only reason that scam worked was because all the other ones didn't want to look like fools, and so they suckered their friends into it too. We don't pity them so much. And if they weren't not very good people to begin with, they're so gullible that it's easy to laugh at them, kind of like the people at the revival meeting. But these victims, these new marks, are sketched out more thoroughly by Twain, and we're meant to feel for them more deeply than we felt for the past ones that the Duke and the King have scammed. There are 3 orphan girls who have been left alone in the world. Their Uncle Peter has died, Peter Wilkes. And the Duke and the King are coming along posing as their other uncles from across the Atlantic, Peter's brothers. And they're planning to take everything from them. And the girls are gullible, but they're also noble. They're considerate of others, even as they're going through this tragedy of their own. Mary Jane, the oldest, is the one who Huck seems to be particularly drawn toward. In fact, it almost looks like he has a bit of a crush on her by the end of his adventure in the town. He says that he's never forgotten her since, speaking to us, the readers, from some future point as he's writing the novel. And he compliments her in the best ways that he knows how. He says that she has a lot of sand, which is a Huck Finn term of endearment, I guess. The youngest sister, Joanna, who has a hair lip, she's also sketched in pretty well for us. She seems to be a bit like a girl version of Huck. She can tell when he's making up stories, and she almost catches on to the scam until her sisters, in a gesture of kindness, tell her to be nicer to Huck, because he's a stranger there among them, so she shouldn't be arguing with him. So, the Duke and the King have managed to steal all of the inheritance money left to these girls, and Huck decides that he's going to steal it back and make sure that they get it. And this isn't the first time in the book that he's gone out of his way to help other people. Remember that he tried to get assistance for the robbers on the shipwreck, even though he knew they were dangerous and bad people. Here, he is actually working for the benefit of those who are worthy of his effort. But things go awry in several humorous twists, which is what we might expect from a Mark Twain story. The bag of inheritance money ends up being hid in the coffin of the deceased, so it's in Peter's lap as he's buried, and the real uncles show up a little bit later, and all of a sudden, nobody knows who is who, and nobody trusts anybody else. Nobody is sure who's the fraud uncles and who are the real ones, and this upsets all of Huck's plans. Well, in the midst of all this, we get one interesting moment of character growth from Huck. He decides, this is before everything goes awry, he decides that he's going to tell Mary Jane all that's happened. And he thinks that telling the truth will be the best thing to do. And that's hilarious because it runs completely counter to everything that Huck has done so far in the novel. He's used lying and making up stories to get out of just about every trouble he's gotten into. But now, he says this. So I went to studying it out. I says to myself, I reckon a body that ups and tells the truth when he's in a tight place is taking considerable many risks. Though I ain't had no experience and can't say for certain. But it looks so to me anyway. And yet, here's a case where I'm blessed if it don't look to me like the truth is better and actually safer than a lie. I must lay it by in my mind and think it over some time or other. It's so kind of strange and unregular. I never see nothing like it. Well, I says to myself at last, I'm a-going to chance it. I'll up and tell the truth this time, though it does seem most like sitting down on a keg of powder and touching it off just to see where you'll go to. So, this is a big moment for Huck, and he's not really comfortable telling the truth. He thinks something bad is going to happen if he does. Another big moment that we need to study comes a little bit later on in the novel. After everyone has escaped from the Wilkes family and their friends, the Duke and the King decide that the time has finally come to sell Jim out. Their scams aren't working anymore, they're low on their money, and it's really kind of insulting that they go ahead and sell him off for just a meager amount of money, $40, just enough to get drunk with. And we'll talk a little bit more about them later on. But Huck, when he first discovers that Jim has been captured, he has a second crisis of conscience, similar to the one that he had several chapters back when he was deciding whether or not to tell on Jim himself. And this time, he's debating about whether or not to write back home to Miss Watson and let her know where Jim is. And we see that still, after all of this time, his conscience has been telling him that helping Jim get to his freedom was wrong, because it's been so ingrained into him by those around him. And he actually turns it into a religious conundrum. He thinks that he'll pray to God to help him not to feel so bad about Jim getting turned in and to help him to do the right thing. But when he goes to pray, he realizes that he can't do it. I'm going to skip around here. I'm not going to read the whole passage because it's long. But he says, "And I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of a boy I was, and be better. So I kneeled down, but the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try and hide it from him. Not from me, neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It was because my heart warn't right. It was because I warn't square. It was because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin, but away inside of me I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing and the clean thing, but deep down in me, I knowed it was a lie, and he knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out." That's interesting. Huck, for all of his ignorance of theology and of religion, and even of a relationship with God, he comes to this understanding that you can't really lie to God when you pray to him. If you're asking him for something that you don't really think is right in your heart or that you disagree with, God's going to know. You can't hide anything from him. And the sin that he's talking about here is the fact that he does still want to help Jim. So he's not going to say, "God, take the sin out of my heart," because he knows he still wants to help Jim. So he writes this letter to Miss Watson, thinking that it's going to help him ease his conscience so he can pray more. But then it still doesn't work. He says he laid the paper down and sat there thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell. And went on thinking, and got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the night time, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we a floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his'n, 'stead of calling me, so I could go on sleeping. And see him how glad he was when I come back out of the fog, and when I come to him again in the swamp up there where the feud was, and such like times. And would always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could think of for me, and how good he always was. And at last I struck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard, and he was so grateful and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and see that paper. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was a-trembling because I'd got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, "All right then, I'll go to hell," and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head and said I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line, being brought up to it, and the other warn't. So, what's going on in Huck's mind here is really interesting. It's why I wanted to pause and read that through for you. We could look at it as a comedic moment, kind of a joke. As an audience in the 21st century reading this, maybe we can laugh at the fact that Huck has actually decided to do the right thing all along, even though he's pretty sure that he's just condemned himself in doing it. But even if it is funny from one point of view, it's no laughing matter to him as he's going through this. He thinks he's going to go to hell for doing what he's about to do, but he does it anyway, because his heart is telling him that he's doing the right thing, even though his conscience and his mind is telling him that he's doing the wrong thing. And what all of this amounts to is that he's made a moral choice of his own, not based off of Tom Sawyer's books or off of the Widow Douglas's rules, and not off of the immoral rules of the robbers or of the Duke and the King either. And we've talked before about how this is a novel that's an example of a coming-of-age tale, where Huck has to grow up. He goes from innocence to maturity by the end. And so this is an important moment for him where he does that. He finally does make his own moral decision. So, after learning where Jim is being kept, at a farmer named Phelps's house, he goes there, and it just so happens that the Phelpses are expecting someone his own age from a visit far away. And it takes Huck a minute to find out who he's supposed to be. He's just going along with it. And then Phelps's wife lets out that they think he's none other than Tom Sawyer. Now, this is a bit of a stretch. He's traveled hundreds of miles at this point, and he happens to stop at the one farm where some boy from back in St. Petersburg, Missouri, is being expected. Okay, so it's a stretch, but let's accept the coincidence. It is a work of art, after all, and look at the irony of the situation. Huck has been asking himself over and over what Tom Sawyer would do in a certain situation. He's judged his own plans and schemes by how well Tom Sawyer would be able to pull them off. And he always thinks, oh, Tom Sawyer would be able to do it better than this, or he'd be able to do it with more style. And now, after he's pretended to be everybody else under the sun, he finally gets to pretend to be somebody that he actually knows. He gets to step into Tom Sawyer's shoes. So Tom is going to show up in next week's readings, and we'll see in those chapters how this story all ties together and ends. So, for next time, finish the novel, and we'll discuss it in class. Thanks.